Okay, I think we're close enough to the start of the start time that we can just start. And if people come in, then they can come in, and that will be fine. This is an example lecture to give you a kind of a taster of kind of how some of the teaching works on our university courses. Come in if you know. Okay, don't come in. So this is a lecture that this is part of a lecture, so I won't kind of like force you to watch like the whole of a lecture because they're quite long, 50 minutes long. So this is part of a course which I teach on oceanography. So this is one of the core courses for the Earth Sciences degree, Environmental Geosciences. So we have approximately 20 students from Environmental Geoscience, and they all take this course. But the overall numbers on this course last year was 88. So we get a lot of students from outside kind of the degree program taking this course as an option. This is one of the features of quite a lot of the courses, particularly in the pre-honours, the first 2 years of study, is that you'll get to choose like things that are not part of your degree to experience kind of other subjects and get a taster of those. Okay. We get students from all of these kind of different flavours of degrees taking this course. Now, I'm not going to be able to give the lecture as I would if it was a real lecture, because what I don't do, and what many people don't do, is just kind of you arrive at the lecture having done nothing, and then there's the talking, and then you go away. Okay, that doesn't happen. So what I tend to do is that there's this website that we use, which is called Learn, because you'll be learning, and each of the courses uses this website to kind of like store the content so students can access it in a variety of ways. So it might have just like the PowerPoint slides, so you can go through them at your own speed, like before or after the lecture. So we don't have to print out everything and use loads of trees. We can give you everything electronically. There will also be maybe some stuff I want you to kind of read up on before the lecture, or more commonly now, I make short videos of some of the background science, so students can watch those at their own speed and kind of stop them and maybe ask questions on a discussion forum so that they're prepared for the content of the lecture. So they can get more out of it than just kind of sitting there going, oh, this is new and exciting, what was this all about? And then being less effective. So we have this thing here. Just to point out that all of the lectures are recorded for most courses. So I'm actually recording this now. So if you want a copy of this, then I can, hopefully it will be successful and I will be sending it to you. So if you go to the Earth Sciences stand or the ecology stand, all of the information on there has got like an email address on. Email that and we'll be able to get you a copy of this kind of stuff. So this is really useful for students for consolidating their learning. So after going to the lecture, they can listen back to the content at their own speed. They can stop and start the video, make notes as they're going through that process, and kind of hopefully learn more effectively than just trying to remember what was in the lecture. Similarly, the Learn site is also used as a kind of a signposting point to point to the textbooks and reading materials for the course. And most textbooks are now available online, so that reduces the cost that students have to go through to learn stuff. So you basically, we have a link to the library from the Learn site, which then takes you to kind of where that book is. Now, sometimes that'll be, this book is on a shelf in this building, and you have to go there and read it. Or you can download PDFs of that book, and through some kind of PDF witchcraft, after a day the PDF disappears. So you can't kind of steal the book and then sell it on the internet, but you can read it, and then if it disappears, you can then download it again and stuff. So we have all that. So example here is Ocean Circulation, which is the course for this book, and it has lots of interesting maths and oceanography in it. So just to point out here, so these are some of the kind of the videos that I might ask students to watch for the background chemistry of this lecture, but you can't have already watched those because that's in the past. And you can't travel back in time and do this reading before this lecture because that's not how time works. So I can't give you the lecture as I would. So I'm going to give you slightly differently, and I'm going to start off, I think, with, we'll start off actually with this YouTube video that I have found. When I say I found it, I made it. Where's she gone? Come back. Okay, so we've got... Okay, I've got a very annoying voice, I realise, by recording stuff. So this is an experiment that we did on the front lawn outside of the geology department. I just removed that mouse off there. So that's me in a different flowery shirt, and that's me with no hair. Okay, so what this is a bottle of cabbage juice, concentrated cabbage juice. Because I thought rather than juice a cabbage every time I wanted to do the experiment, I'd make a concentrate using the freeze dryer. This was an extremely bad idea. That stuff really stinks. But anyway, so if you're going to do this at home, just juice a cabbage, right, and then use that. So cabbage juice in 2 beakers here, and what I'm going to do is move it forwards to here. Okay, with my safety hands, I've put in some dry ice into one of the beakers. Okay, so always use your safety hands. So dry ice is just solid CO2. So you can see that that's warming up because it's in water that's basically, I guess, outside temperature. And the CO2 is bubbling through that cabbage juice. And hopefully one of the things you can see now is that this cabbage juice is kind of purple. And the one with the CO2 bubbling through it has gone pink. And that's because cabbage juice has got a molecule in it, an anthocyanin, which is a coloured compound, which the colour is pH dependent. So it's dependent on the acidity. So what's happening here is the CO2 is acidifying the water. Okay, so I would have probably asked students to watch that video and some background chemistry. I'll just stop that. It's just Stoppy McStopface. There we go. That wasn't me. So if we go back to the good stuff. Okay. So another bit of background I might ask students to read up on is a little bit of background biology of corals. Okay, so corals are an animal. They're basically related to sea anemones and jellyfish. And they're an animal that has basically a very simple kind of sac-like stomach, and they've got some tentacles which they can use to kind of capture some particles from the water and pass those into their stomach. But some corals, and particularly the corals that live near the sea surface, these tropical corals, they have symbiotic algae that live within the animal, and those algae photosynthesize, so they take CO2 ultimately from the water surrounding them, diffuses into the algal cell, and they produce organic matter and oxygen. Okay, so it's photosynthesis, so I expect that maybe not all students might be intimately related with photosynthesis, so we provided a little bit of background information on that. The coral then takes that organic matter and effectively eats it. So it's using the algae as basically providing a food source as well as the food that they can eat. So the corals have got 2 sources of food. They can basically filter feed from the water, but they can also use these algae inside them to produce their own food. So this is fine until it's not fine. So there are particular sets of environmental conditions where corals, basically they get a little bit unhappy with these algae that are living inside them, and they go, get out. And the coral is still alive, they're still fine, but they've just ejected these symbiotic algae, so they appear to be white. Well, I mean, they are white, because they've ejected these coloured algae. And the reason one of the reasons that corals bleach is when there are extreme events in the ocean that kind of lead to warming. So it's not the actual, there's no kind of like threshold temperature by which all corals bleach. It's whether the corals living in a particular area are experiencing a kind of effectively a heat wave, some anomalously warm temperatures for that area. So the corals have got used to living in, say, 30 degrees Celsius water, and if it gets to 35, then they're like, no. Whereas corals that were maybe used to living at 25 degrees Celsius, they would have bleached at a much lower temperature. So it's not a specific temperature, it's a kind of like an anomaly. If you get anomalously warm temperature, these corals bleach. Okay, so that's the background of the corals. Now, a little bit more of the detail of the background of that chemistry of carbon dioxide dissolving in water. So we saw that carbon dioxide, when you add it to water, it acidifies that water. And we'll, so the reason for that are these equations here. So CO2, it doesn't just dissolve in water, it actually reacts with the water to form this molecule here, which is called carbonic acid. Okay, and the name's kind of giving it away, that molecule can break apart and release hydrogen ions, which leads to the acidification of the water. So if we look at these chemical equations, we have a form of carbon as CO2. We have other compounds that are also CO2. We have a bit of bicarbonate, which is this one, a bit of carbonate ion, and this carbonic acid. As it turns out, that this breaks apart very rapidly, so we don't actually get any of that dissolved in the water. So you can kind of think of it that in water, you might have some dissolved CO2, but you'll have these other carbon-bearing species as well. And if you look at this, so actually go back to this one here, so you can see when CO2 dissolves in water, some of the CO2 will stay as carbon dioxide molecules just floating around in the water. But then some of it will be transformed to these other forms of carbon. And you can see by the size of these boxes, most of the carbon that's being put into the water from exchange with the atmosphere is these other forms of carbon, these bicarbonate and carbonate ion. So that's kind of shown on this diagram here. So if you kind of think back to some maybe school chemistry that you might have done, is that these reactions are equilibrium reactions, so they go both directions. And if you increase the concentration of stuff on this side, it'll force the reaction over to the other side. And the important thing is that these reactions, although, so we mentioned that CO2 acidifies the water, okay, so it produces these hydrogen ions. So hydrogen ions are parts of the components of this equilibrium. So if we add hydrogen ions, if we lower the pH, we make it more acidic, we force these equilibrium reactions to the other side. So as it turns out, the relative proportions of CO2, bicarbonate ion and carbonate ion, are dependent on the pH. So we've got very low pH, almost all of the carbon is as this CO2 form. If you've got very high pH, the carbon is as this carbonate ion form. Now this is really important for the climate because only the CO2 form can exchange with the atmosphere. These other forms of carbon can't get up into the atmosphere. So this exchange between the ocean and the atmosphere effectively determines how much CO2 is in the ocean and how much is in the atmosphere. So if you can force more of the carbon in the ocean to be these kinds here, the bicarbonate ion and the carbonate ion, means less will be CO2, which means that less will be in the atmosphere. So the capacity of the ocean to absorb carbon dioxide from the air depends on the pH. And that's explained in this diagram here, which basically is the amount of carbon that is stored in the ocean. Okay, and you can see this is a logarithmic scale. So at high pHs, we can store huge amounts of carbon in the ocean, whereas at low pHs, we can't. And that carbon will therefore degas into the atmosphere. So this is kind of good because the pHs of the ocean is about here, about 8.1. Which means that we can store loads of carbon in the ocean, which is really good, because a third of the carbon that we've burnt with fossil fuels has actually gone into the ocean. Only a third of it is left in the atmosphere. The other third is in the biosphere for plants have photosynthesized more effectively. So this is good, because it means that there's less climate change than there would have been, but it's also bad because adding CO2 to the ocean acidifies the ocean. Acidifying the ocean moves us to the left on this diagram, which means the ocean can hold less CO2, so can hold less carbon, which means that more in the atmosphere. So it's a positive feedback loop. And it's not positive in that it's good, it's positive in that it's self-reinforcing. So more CO2 in the atmosphere, more CO2 in the ocean, more acidity in the ocean, less capacity to store carbon in the ocean, therefore more carbon in the atmosphere, and the cycle repeats. Okay. So that is the introduction to the lecture. Now the lecture starts. Okay, so there's a lot to get in there. There's some quite complicated concepts, which is why we give it to you before the lecture to kind of get used to it and get familiar with the science that's required. Okay, so coral reefs. This is the Great Barrier Reef. So they're quite often kind of relatively flat bits of the ocean next to land with deeper water off to the side. And that's because these coral reefs have gradually built out from the coast to over here to build this kind of shelf-like structure. And what are they made of? So there are many organisms that live on coral reefs. One of them, corals like this. We might also have sponges. We might also have algae, all kinds of organisms that are living on this coral reef. So we want to think about what are these organisms doing. Okay, so an algae is producing organic matter. It's taking kind of sunlight and CO2 and producing organic carbon. Corals also, they're doing that. They're taking some CO2 using these photosynthetic algae. They're producing organic matter in the coral. But they're also producing this mineral calcium carbonate. It's the skeleton which the coral is made of. And it's not just corals that are doing this. There are all kinds of other organisms that do it. So here are some corals. So these are producing organic matter and this hard calcium carbonate. There are also some algae that produce calcium carbonate. So it's not just kind of soft green algae. You get kind of all kinds of hard algae that produce these calcareous. They're not quite skeletons, but they secrete calcium carbonate. This is not a seagrass. This is an algae called Halimeda. Obviously, you can see it's green. It's photosynthesizing, but it's also producing lots of calcium carbonate plates. But you get organisms that just produce calcium carbonate. So they're sea urchins, for example. Some of them have photosynthetic algae, but most of them just produce kind of calcium carbonate. What are they? Tests, I think, and spiky things, right? So don't step on those. You also have organisms called foraminifera. These produce calcium carbonate as well. Even fish. So fish, they can basically drink in seawater and they can poop out microcrystalline calcium carbonate. Okay. You also have things like seagrasses, so these tend to just produce organic matter. Okay, so why have I been going on about this calcium carbonate production? What's all that about? So if we have a look at some of the chemistry that's going on, so the organisms that are producing organic matter, so they're basically doing this. I would point out here that this is not the equation for photosynthesis, in case there are any biologists in the room. If you got a biology hire or something like that, it's more complicated than that. But this is the summary. You take carbon dioxide and water and you produce organic matter and oxygen. The opposite of that is respiration, so all of the animals are doing this. In fact, all of the plants are doing that as well. But then you also have this production of calcium carbonate, and these are the equations that summarize that. So they take calcium ions and bicarbonate ions, and they produce calcium carbonate. Now, here's the weird thing, right? So you're taking carbon out of the ocean. It was dissolved, and you're putting it into a solid thing, right? So you would think maybe that's taking carbon out of the system. But this reaction actually produces CO2. So if corals grow, when they produce these skeletons, they might be taking some carbon out of the ocean, but they are adding CO2 to the ocean. And if you dissolve the corals, you're basically taking away CO2. So we have this kind of these summary processes that are going on here. And this might be where I might stop and do a kind of a question and answer kind of session. But it's quite late in the day and you're clearly too shy to shout out answers to me, which is fine. I mean, I'll look at that. So photosynthesis, okay, that is going to hopefully, so that's going to lower the amount of hydrogen ions because you're taking away CO2. So you're taking away the thing that's acidifying the ocean. So that's going to make pH go up. Okay, pretty standard. Respiration is the opposite. Now, carbonate production, this is adding CO2 and removing the bicarbonate ion. So that's actually going to increase the amount of hydrogen ions and acidify the ocean. And dissolution is the opposite. Okay, so growing a coral reef will acidify the ocean, which will ultimately lead to more CO2 going into the atmosphere. which is kind of quite an odd thing and counterintuitive thing to understand. So we're going to have a look at what actually happens on a coral reef. So this is a coral reef from the Pacific. This is Palmyra Atoll. It's one of the most pristine kind of reefs in the world. It's a very constitutionally odd place. It's part of the USA, but not part of the USA. It's kind of like the personal fiefdom of the president. So not very many people live there. 4, last count, I think. So what we've got here is, this is the outline of the reef. So just off here is some really deep water. And then we've got 2 stations recording in the middle of the lagoon and then right on the edge of the reef here. So what I want you to concentrate on here are the data recorded of pH. These are the blue lines here. So the average pH of the ocean surrounding the island is the black solid line. Okay? And the dashed black line is basically how low the ocean outside the island gets on average each year. Right? So you get some variation outside the island, but it's quite small. So what you can see, first of all, is that the site that's in the middle of the reef, that's this one here, all of the values are quite low. So the pH is lower on the reef than outside the reef. And it's still low right on the edge of the reef here as well. And the other thing that's really striking in these data is that there's a lot of variability, up and down, up and down, up and down, up and down, up and down. And it looks quite regular. And that's a day-night cycle. So on this coral reef, we have processes that are changing the pH quite dramatically on this day-night cycle. So what's causing that? So we're now zooming in to actually on a different study, but zooming in on the processes that are happening on a day-night cycle. So this is the day, this is the night. And we can see that the blue curve here is irradiance, so that's how sunny it is. So you can see it's sunny in the daytime, it's not sunny at night time. And this G net, that's how much calcification is happening. So how much of this calcium carbonate is being produced. And you can see it's being produced throughout the day and the night, but it's produced more in the day. And that makes sense because the coral's got more energy from those photosynthetic algae to do stuff, to make its skeleton. Okay. So how does that affect the chemistry? So in the daytime, we've got photosynthesis and this carbonate production going on. So in the daytime, the photosynthesis wins out and the pH is high. So we've unacidified the water because the algae are doing this photosynthesis. But at night time, the pH drops down again because the system is dominated by calcium carbonate production. There's no photosynthesis because it's nighttime. So the pH goes down at night time. Now the effect that that has is shown in this thing up here, this omega aragonite, which is too small for you to read. But hopefully the next slide will explain that. And what that is basically the solubility or the saturation state of the mineral that the coral is made of. So when that is high, then that mineral will want to precipitate, so corals will want to grow. When it's low, the corals won't want to grow, they'll want to dissolve. So we can have a look at the effect of that on calcification percent. So as we increase the acidity, as we lower the pH, the calcification rate of these, this is an algae, these are 2 corals, it goes down. Okay? So the corals find it harder to grow in an acidified ocean. And when they grow, they acidify the ocean as well as the acidification that we're adding from the CO2 in the atmosphere. It's not great for corals. But it's not just that. There are other effects that happen to these corals. So they also get more susceptible to bleaching. So you see that at these lower pHs, the bleaching incidence is higher. Okay? We don't really fully understand the mechanisms that are going on here because it's not the acidity that's causing the bleaching. The bleaching is still being caused here by these extreme warm events. But when an extreme warm event happens, the corals that are living in these low pH waters, they are more susceptible to bleaching. Okay? And this is going to continue into the future as we kind of add CO2 to the atmosphere progressively. You can see here that the pH of the ocean in green here is declining. And that's because this CO2 is acidifying the water, so it's making it more likely that these corals will bleach over time. I guess what's probably a bigger effect is actually the increase in the extreme warm events that actually cause the bleaching. but we're adding another kind of like nail in their coffin here. Okay, so that's kind of one half of the old the lecture. The next half is on nutrients. So this is another coral reef. This is Heron Island on the Great Barrier Reef. And corals really don't like there being lots of nutrients in the water. Okay, so they need some nutrients, but not many. So this is a kind of I mean, because they've got algae, those algae need nutrients. They need nitrate and phosphate to grow, just like any kind of plant. So if you have no nutrients, the corals don't do very well. If you add a little bit, they do well. But then if you add lots of nutrients, they eventually kind of like, they decline and they don't like it. So there are kind of direct effects on the coral, and there are also indirect effects. So there are things that happen to corals which make them less happy. So I'm not going to cover the direct effects. We're just going to look at these indirect effects because we've only got so long in this lecture. So if you've got lots of nutrients, algae need nutrients to grow, so you'll have lots of algae growing. And if you're a coral and you're living underneath all of this stuff, then it's not going to be so good for you. So increased algal content, either algae, benthic seaweed slime on the sea floor covering the coral is bad, but also algae in the water column reduce the amount of light getting through. So they can be smothered or they can be blinded. But also, there are a load of other kind of, I guess, non-obvious things that are happening. So algae, seaweed, doesn't like being eaten. Right? So seaweed have evolved to kind of resist herbivory by fish. So fish come along and eat the seaweed. That's not so good for the seaweed. So they've basically developed these defense mechanisms. So just like some plants, they give off nasty chemicals that make the fish go, I'm not going to eat that. And it turns out that those chemicals given off by algae damage corals. Okay, so if you have, so we've got a bunch of different algae along here. So the control is adding no algae and then seeing what happens to the corals. So when we add algae to corals, again, as well as you're getting direct damage, it also increases the prevalence of these bleaching events and also makes them less photosynthetically active. Okay. So there's also the chemical warfare. The algae also has biological warfare against the corals. So you might have some corals. If you have lots of algae in the water, then that algae will be rapidly kind of growing and then decaying, growing, decaying. There'll be lots of dissolved organic carbon in the water. And that dissolved organic carbon is food for disease. So pathogens, bacteria, viruses will make use of all of that dissolved organic carbon and increase basically the concentration of nasty pathogens in the water. And this causes corals to basically get these diseases. So we don't really understand the mechanisms of these diseases that well, but their incidence of these diseases goes up when you add nutrients to the water. So I guess that's kind of getting towards kind of the end of the lecture. We would go back and look at some of the direct effects as well if this was the real one. But we have a little summary here. So you should know that coral bleaching is. You should know that it's being the susceptibility of corals to bleaching is being changed by pH in the ocean. And that's kind of like a global effect that's increasing as we add CO2 to the atmosphere and are generally acidifying all of the oceans. But we also have local effects of anthropogenic activities where we're adding nutrients in kind of untreated sewage or increased runoff from farmers' fields. That's adding nutrients which is affecting the corals in a variety of other ways. Okay? At that point, I might, in a lecture, also want to point out to students that there are revision aids out there for you guys to kind of get stuck into. So I have a selection of exam feedback videos, which are terribly dull to watch, but are really useful for kind of understanding what we're actually asking for in exam questions. So that's a thing that students like quite a lot. And then we might have, I guess, so this was a pre-honors course. If this was a fourth year course or maybe a master's level course, we might kind of take the lecture a little bit further and have a discussion about what might we actually do about these kind of local effects or these global effects. How can we mitigate those with different kind of local or kind of global strategies of reef restoration, or kind of like trying to promote these little coral gardens, which we might use kind of sunken shipwrecks to try and promote additional growth. Or we might try and combat the acidification, because if we try and fix these coral reefs by growing more corals, that will acidify the ocean some more. So maybe we should be promoting something that just removes CO2, so maybe incorporating more seagrasses into coral reef areas and deliberately destroying areas of coral reef so we can promote seagrass growth to protect the areas around there. I'm not saying that's a good idea, but it's something that we could investigate. Yeah, so that is it. I've gone on far too long. Sorry for that if you've missed your bus, but if you have any questions, then I'm happy to address questions and answer those. If you want to leave and run away, I'm quite happy for that to happen. If you need to contact me or anybody, it's earth.sciences@ed.ac.uk, and that's it. So there we go.